The evening air outside the hospital carried the metallic tang of rain on concrete, a storm pressing low against the city skyline. People hurried through the sliding glass doors, their conversations hushed, their bodies bent against the chill. Nora stood just beyond the glow of the lobby lights, her hands trembling at her sides. She had rehearsed the words in her mind 100 times, but they caught in her throat now, jagged and raw. She watched the man by the valet station, his attention fixed on the glowing screen of his phone. Everything about him was polished, the tailored suit that fit his frame like armor, the expensive watch that gleamed each time he lifted his hand, the calm authority in the way he carried himself. He was the kind of man who belonged in boardrooms and glossy magazines, not in the orbit of her life. But desperation didn't care about class, wealth, or pride. Desperation had stripped her down to this moment. Her feet moved before her mind could stop them. She crossed the wet pavement, each step echoing the thud of her own racing heart. "Excuse me," she said, her voice breaking like glass. He looked up, startled by the intrusion, green eyes meeting hers with polite distance. There was a flicker of curiosity, nothing more. To him she must have looked like any other stranger, dark curls escaping their braid, jeans faded at the knees, sweater worn thin at the elbows. A woman who had been run ragged by life. "Yes?" His tone was courteous, but edged with impatience. Nora's mouth went dry. How did a person ask something so impossible? She tried to speak, faltered, then saw her daughter's face in her mind. Leia, lying pale beneath the hospital sheets, whispering that her heart wasn't just sick, it was lonely. The memory propelled the words forward. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I know this sounds insane, but will you be my doggus? Iter's father? Just for one day." His eyes narrowed, suspicion flashing sharp. He shifted his weight as though ready to walk away. "I'm sorry." "What?" Nora's hands twisted together, the tremor in her body visible now. Tears spilled hot down her cheeks. "She's 6 years old," she said quickly. "She's dying. Her heart won't last much longer, and all she wants, her last wish, is to know what it feels like to have a daddy. She sees the other kids in the ward, their fathers holding them, spinning them, calling them princess, and I can't give her that. I've tried for 6 years to be everything she needs, but I can't be this, not alone." The man said nothing. His silence was heavier than words, the kind of silence forged by years of mistrust. He had heard every con, every scheme, every fabricated sob story designed to pry open his wallet. He was wealthy enough to attract predators, and his instincts screamed that this was madness. Yet there was something in her eyes, a rawness he couldn't categorize. She wasn't calculating him, wasn't measuring the worth of his watch or his car. She was simply breaking. Nora reached for his coat without thinking, her fingers clutching the fine wool like it was a lifeline. "She doesn't have much time," she whispered, her voice shredded. "Please, just one afternoon, one memory where she knows what it feels like to be loved by a father." He froze, startled by her touch, by the unvarnished plea. Every instinct told him to step back, to end this madness and walk away. But another voice rose within him, quiet and unfamiliar, insisting that this mattered. He saw flashes of his own childhood, empty corridors of expensive boarding schools, parents who measured affection in achievement. He had never known the warmth of arms that pulled close simply because he existed. The ache he had buried for decades stirred alive, echoing in the desperate woman's words. Nora must have seen rejection in his hesitation, because she dropped her hands, shaking her head. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, retreat in her voice. "I shouldn't have asked. Forget it." He surprised himself by speaking before she could turn away. "Wait." The word came rough, pulled from a place he didn't recognize. He studied her face again, the streaks of mascara, the exhaustion etched into every line, the fire still burning despite it all. For the first time in years, something shifted in the carefully built walls of Marcus Hayes. His phone buzzed in his hand, demanding attention, but he ignored it. The hospital loomed behind her, lights flickering in sterile windows. Somewhere inside was a little girl with hours instead of weeks, waiting for a father who would never come, unless he stepped into that role now. He took a slow breath, the weight of the decision heavy in his chest. "Which room is she in?" he asked softly. Nora blinked, disbelief flashing through her tears. "What?" He met her gaze without hesitation. "Your daughter. Which room is she in?" And with those words, the life of a stranger, the future of a dying child, and his own guarded heart shifted onto a collision course that none of them could escape. The fluorescent lights in the pediatric ward hummed faintly as Nora pushed the heavy door open. Her pulse hammered in her ears, louder than the machines that kept her daughter alive. Marcus followed her inside, his presence filling the small room like a storm pressing at the windows. Leia sat upright in her bed, her curls flattened against the pillow, eyes fixed on the city lights outside. She looked so small among the wires and tubes, so fragile it made Nora's breath catch. The little girl turned at the sound of footsteps, her gaze sweeping over her mother first, then landing on the stranger beside her. She studied him with the quiet intensity that only children possessed, the kind that saw beyond the surface of things. Nora felt her throat close as she forced the words out. "This is your daddy, sweetheart." For a long heartbeat this said. Room was silent except for the beep of the monitors. Leia's lips parted, her wide brown eyes searching Marcus's face for a sign of truth or betrayal. Then she whispered the word as if testing it on her tongue for the first time. "Daddy." Marcus's chest tightened as if the word had hooked itself into his ribs. He had been called many things in his life, visionary, ruthless success story, but never that. The word cracked open something long buried. He crossed the room slowly, almost afraid to break the spell, and knelt beside her bed. "Hello, princess," he said, the endearment falling from his lips with surprising ease. Nora braced herself for doubt or disappointment, but instead Leia's entire face lit with a radiance so pure it made the machines seem like background noise. She opened her thin arms, and without hesitation, Marcus gathered her carefully into his embrace. He could feel her tiny heartbeat against his chest, faltering but steady, a fragile drum that somehow struck straight through his defenses. The moment stretched, and Nora watched with a mixture of awe and fear. Was this too much? Was she giving her daughter a dream that would only shatter later? But then Leia giggled, the sound light and wondrous, filling the sterile room with warmth. "You came," she said simply, as if she had been waiting her whole life for this moment. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat burning with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself in years. "Of course I came, princess, I always will." The words surprised even him. They were more than comfort, more than play acting. They felt like a vow. Nora's hands gripped the edge of the bed, trembling. She had begged a stranger for a miracle, and in this moment it felt like she had conjured one. Yet beneath the glow of hope, a sharper tension pulsed. What if Marcus walked away tomorrow? What if Leia's fragile trust was broken worse than before? Leia nestled against him with complete certainty, her small voice muffled against his chest. "Can you tell me about the stars Daddy Mama says when people die, they become stars? I want to know what kind I will be." The innocence of the question cut through Marcus like a blade. He looked up and met Nora's eyes across the room. She was frozen between gratitude and terror. He smoothed Leia's curls and said softly, "You will be the brightest one of all, princess, bright enough to light up the whole sky." And as Nora watched her daughter smile in a way she hadn't seen in months, she felt the ground shift beneath her. What had begun as a desperate plea was already becoming something far more dangerous, something real. Night pressed against the hospital windows. The city lights blurred into a soft haze. Marcus sat in the chair beside Leia's bed, his suit jacket folded over the armrest, his tie loosened. Hours had passed since he had first stepped into this room, yet he had not moved. Leia had curled against his side as though she had known him all her life, her tiny hand resting on his chest as if to anchor him there. Each time she called him daddy, the words seemed to echo louder in his chest, shaking loose walls he had built for decades. Nora sat quietly in the corner, her eyes moving between them with a mix of wonder and dread. She had watched men leave too many times before. Ethan had left when Leia was 2 days old. Friends had left when the burden became too heavy. Even family had drifted away, unable to face the unending storm of illness and bills. She feared Marcus would be no different. And yet here he was, reading softly from a storybook, his voice steady, his hand careful as it smoothed back Laya's curls. "Tell me about space, Daddy," Leia whispered when the story ended. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with curiosity. "I want to know about the stars I am going to become." The words cut like glass through Marcus's chest. He paused, the book slipping from his hand. He had heard doctors talk of her failing heart in the hallways, had seen Nora's silent tears when she thought no one was watching. But hearing the child speak of her own death so casually nearly broke him. "Space is endless," he said, his voice low and rough. "There are billions of stars, and each one shines in its own way. Some burn so bright that they light up everything around them. Those stars are rare and special, like me," Leia asked, tilting her head with the kind of wisdom only a child could carry. "Exactly like you," Princess Marcus replied, meaning every word. Nora pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wet. Her daughter had not laughed in weeks, not until this stranger had walked into their lives. Now here she was, smiling, her small face glowing despite the machines around her. Leia giggled. "Daddy, you are funny. Serious people saying funny things is the best kind of funny." The sound of her laughter filled the room, soft and startling, like the first song of dawn. Marcus's throat tightened. He had spent his life chasing profits and power, and yet nothing had ever felt as important as making this child laugh. She shifted in his arms, her voice growing thoughtful. "Mama works too much," she said softly. "She works for me every day, and nobody takes care of her. Maybe you should take care of her too." The observation was so pure, so unguarded that Marcus turned his gaze toward Nora. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, neither looked away. He saw the exhaustion in her face, the fight that had worn her down, yet had never broken her. She was beautiful, not in the polished way of the women he usually met, but in the raw, resilient way of someone who had carried the weight of the world alone. Marcus tightened his hold on Leia, whispering gently, "Then that is what I will do, Princess. I will take care of both of you." The words hung heavy in the room, more than comfort, more than pretend. They felt like a vow, and as Nora stared at him in stunned silence, she realized the dangerous truth. The stranger she had begged for one day was already becoming something neither of them could walk away from. The hospital corridor was quiet, except for the steady hum of machines and the faint squeak of nurses' shoes on polished floors. Marcus stood at the window of Leia's room long after she had fallen asleep, her tiny fingers still curled around the stuffed elephant he had brought her. Nora hovered near the doorway, torn between gratitude and unease. Every hour that passed made his presence feel less like an act and more like a claim. When Marcus finally turned from the glass, his expression was unreadable, but his voice carried the kind of certainty that made Nora's heart pound. "I want another doctor to see her. Someone who can give us answers beyond what Lopez has given. We can't afford that," Nora said too quickly, her defenses rising before hope could creep in. "I didn't ask about what you can afford," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm saying I will make the calls." The simple statement struck her harder than she expected. It sounded like permanence, like responsibility, like a man stepping into shoes he had no right to fill. And yet in her chest a dangerous flicker of hope began to stir. Before she could answer, the door pushed open without a knock. A nurse stepped aside, revealing a man whose face Nora hadn't seen in 6 years. Ethan, the name barely formed in her mind before her stomach dropped. His presence was like a wound reopening, his dark hair slicked back, his smile practiced but empty. His eyes went straight to the bed where Leia slept, then flicked to Marcus with something sharp and ugly. "Hello, Nora," he said smoothly as if no time had passed. "I heard our daughter was sick." Nora's voice caught in her throat. Anger and fear warred inside her. "You don't get to say our. She's mine. You left." Ethan's gaze shifted to Marcus with a sneer. "Who are you supposed to be, playing house with my family?" Marcus didn't move from his place beside the bed, his posture calm but his eyes dangerous. "I am her father." "No," Ethan snapped. "I am her real father." He let the word hang like poison in the air. Nora felt her knees weaken. The last thing Leia needed was this man bringing chaos into her fragile world. But before she could speak, a small voice rose from the bed. "Daddy." Both men froze. Leia had stirred awake, her eyes glassy but focused. She looked past Ethan as if he were a shadow and stretched her hand toward Marcus. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside her bed. She smiled weakly. "Daddy, I had a dream you were still here. I'm here, Princess," he whispered, brushing her curls back. "And I'm not going anywhere." Ethan's jaw tightened, his face flushing with something between fury and disbelief. He opened his mouth, but Leia's next words cut him off. "Mama, who is that man?" Nora's throat tightened. "He is no one, baby. Go back to sleep." Leia nodded, her eyes already closing again. Her trust wrapped around Marcus like armor. When Ethan finally spoke again, his voice was low and cold. "We'll see what a judge thinks about who she belongs to." He left the room, but the shadow of his threat remained. Nora's hands trembled as she leaned against the wall. She had feared Marcus might walk away, but now a worse fear gripped her, that Ethan had come back not for love, but for something far more dangerous. Marcus's gaze found hers, steady, unflinching. He reached for her hand and said softly, "Whatever he tries, whatever storm he brings, you're not alone in this anymore. She has me, and so do you." And for the first time in years, Nora let herself believe him. The next morning, the hospital room felt heavier than the night before, as if Ethan's sudden reappearance had left a shadow clinging to every corner. Nora barely slept, her body braced for another knock on the door, another intrusion into the fragile world she had built for her daughter. Leia, however, woke with a brightness in her eyes that surprised them both. She reached for Marcus before she reached for anyone else. "Good morning, Daddy," she whispered, her smile soft but real. The word wrapped around Marcus like a chain, and a promise one he hadn't expected but could no longer deny. Marcus spent the day making calls, his voice clipped with urgency as he reached doctors across the country. Names that made nurses glance in awe, specialists who rarely took cases but were suddenly listening because Marcus Hayes was asking. One name rose above the rest, Dr. Sofia Alvarez, a pediatric cardiologist known for miracles where none should exist. She agreed to review Leia's case that same week. Nora listened from the corner of the room, equal parts stunned and terrified. Every call Marcus made, every connection he pulled, tightened the bond between him and her daughter, and with that bond came risk. If Ethan truly meant to fight them legally, what weapons did she have to protect Leia from being used as a bargaining chip? By afternoon, Dr. Lopez arrived with the results of Leia's latest tests. His face carried the grim weight of a man who had delivered too much bad news. "The medication is no longer holding," he said gently. "Her heart function has declined more rapidly than expected. We are looking at days, not weeks." The words made Nora's body sag against the chair. Her daughter's laughter from that very morning now felt like a cruel echo. Marcus stood very still, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on Lopez. "What about alternatives? Clinical trials, transplants, experimental treatments, anything?" Lopez shook his head. "I'm afraid she is too weak for a transplant, and the trials available require stability she no longer has. Comfort care is the only path left." Silence filled the room, broken only by the beeping monitor beside Leia's bed. Nora's tears came fast and silent, her hands clutching the thin blanket. Marcus, however, moved closer to the bed, his voice low and steady as he spoke to the little girl who watched him with trusting eyes. "Princess," he whispered, "you remember how you told me you're good at doing impossible things?" She nodded, her eyes wide and certain. "Then we're going to find the impossible answer together." That night, after visiting hours ended and the ward quieted, Marcus and Nora sat side by side outside Leia's room. The glow from the machines painted her daughter in fragile light. Nora finally turned to him, her voice breaking. "Why are you doing this? You don't know us. You could walk away and no one would blame you." Marcus's answer came without hesitation. "Because I know what it feels like to be left behind. I won't let her feel that. Not from me. Not ever." Nora's breath caught in her chest. Something inside her that had been locked away for 6 years shifted. His certainty, his vow. It was more dangerous than Ethan's threats because it made her want to believe. Inside the room, Leia stirred in her sleep, clutching the stuffed elephant to her chest. She whispered, "Daddy," as though calling him back to her, even in dreams. Marcus stood immediately, walked to her bedside, and took her hand. Her breathing steadied her small body. Relaxing, Nora watched him from the doorway, her heart trembling with something she had not felt in years. Not fear, not exhaustion, hope, real and dangerous hope. The storm outside the hospital broke just before dawn, thunder rolling across the city like a warning. Nora sat at the edge of Leia's bed, her daughter's fragile chest rising and falling beneath the hum of machines. Marcus had not left his chair all night, his broad frame bent toward the small hand curled inside his own. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain drifting through the half-open window, but beneath it all pulsed the sharp scent of fear. When the first light touched the glass, Marcus's phone rang. He answered with the urgency of a man used to commanding armies of assistants and lawyers. But this was different. This was personal. His voice was low, clipped, but filled with something Nora had never heard before. Desperation. When he ended the call, he looked at her with a mixture of triumph and urgency. "I spoke with Dr. Sofia Alvarez. She's expecting us in Houston tonight. She wants to see Leia immediately." Nora's heart lurched. "Tonight? How can we possibly move her?" Lopez said, "She only has days. She can't handle the stress of travel." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then she doesn't have days to waste. We go tonight." Before she could argue further, the door opened and Lopez stepped inside. His expression grave. He explained. "Leia's latest numbers showed rapid decline. Too rapid. We may be looking at hours, not days." Nora's knees nearly buckled. She gripped the bed rail to steady herself. Leia stirred at their voices. Her eyes fluttered open, weak but curious. "Mama, why are you crying?" Nora forced a smile. "I'm not crying, baby. I'm just tired." Marcus leaned closer, brushing her curls back with surprising gentleness. "No, princess. She's crying because she loves you so much. Sometimes love spills out as tears." Leia smiled faintly and whispered, "Daddy, will you still be here when I wake up?" Marcus's voice cracked as he answered, "Always, princess. Always." When she drifted back to sleep, Lopez pulled Nora in. To the hall, his voice was heavy with warning. "Moving her could kill her, but leaving her here guarantees it. We are at the end." Marcus joined them, his tone cold and sharp. "I am not watching her die without trying every chance." Nora looked between them, her mind a battlefield of fear and faith. She had begged a stranger for one day of pretend fatherhood, and somehow in less than a week, he was ready to risk everything to save her child. But deeper than the terror was something else, a rising certainty that he was not pretending anymore. The rest of the day moved like a storm inside and out. Marcus made calls arranging a private medical jet equipped with monitors and a pediatric critical care nurse. His resources bent the impossible into shape. Nora signed forms, her hands trembling with every stroke of the pen. The nurses whispered at the speed and scale of what was unfolding. By evening, rain still pounded the city streets when Marcus placed his coat over Nora's shoulders as they walked toward the waiting ambulance. He looked into her eyes and said with a quiet force, "This is not charity. This is family." For the first time, she did not argue. She only nodded her hand, slipping into his as the sirens wailed to life. Somewhere deep inside, the fear and chaos, a truth was beginning to take root. This man had stepped into their lives as a stranger, but he was already becoming the anchor she never knew she needed. And tonight, as they left behind the hospital where she had almost said goodbye forever, she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were carrying their miracle with them. The jet lifted into the storm clouds with a low roar. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow over the hum of medical equipment. Nora sat strapped into her seat, her eyes locked on Leia, who lay on a narrow medical cot monitors, tracking every fragile beat of her heart. A flight nurse hovered nearby, adjusting lines with calm precision, but Nora's body shook with every bump of turbulence. Across from her, Marcus never let go of Leia's hand. His suit jacket was gone, his sleeves rolled back, but his presence filled the cabin like an anchor holding them steady against chaos. Each time Leia's heart monitor beeped irregularly, Nora flinched, but Marcus's jaw only tightened, his voice low and steady, whispering to the child who had claimed him without hesitation. "We're almost there." Princess, just hold on a little longer. You and me, we're going to beat the impossible together. Leia's lips curved weakly. Daddy, are there stars up here closer to the plane? Marcus leaned down, his voice trembling. There are millions of them, and they're cheering for you right now. You're their brightest star. Nora closed her eyes, fighting the tears, threatening to spill. She had carried this burden alone for so long that sharing it now with a man she barely knew both terrified and comforted her. The memory of Ethan barging into the hospital still haunted her, his threats still echoed. But when she opened her eyes and saw Marcus holding their daughter as if he'd been born for it, the fear dulled, replaced by something even more dangerous. Hope. Hours later, the plane touched down in Houston. The storm had followed them, lightning splitting the sky as the ambulance rushed them from runway to hospital. Dr. Sofia Alvarez was already waiting, her presence, sharp, focused, her eyes carrying both authority and compassion. She moved quickly, examining Leia, issuing orders in rapid Spanish to her team, but when she looked up, her gaze softened. Ned, at the sight of Marcus still gripping Leia's hand. She is weaker than I hoped, Dr. Alvarez said, but stronger than most in her condition. If we move quickly, there is a chance, though it is very small. How small? Nora asked, her voice trembling. 10%. Dr. Alvarez answered calmly. 10%, survival may be less. The words cut through Nora like a blade. But before despair could crush her, Marcus spoke with iron in his voice. Then we fight for the 10%. We give her every chance. Dr. Alvarez studied him for a long moment, then nodded. We begin tomorrow morning. That night in the hospital, family suite, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on them. Leia slept between them, her small breaths steady for now. Nora sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the rain streaking down the window, her voice breaking. What if she doesn't make it, Marcus? What if tomorrow is goodbye? Marcus turned toward her, his face raw with the kind of honesty that left no room for doubt. Then I will love her until her last breath, and I will love you through every one after. Because you are my family now. Nora's breath caught in her chest. The word family landed like thunder, shaking everything inside her. She turned to him, not with words, but with a silent truth she could no longer deny. She needed him. She wanted him. She believed him. And in that fragile, charged moment, as lightning lit the Texas sky, the stranger she had begged to pretend had already become the man she could not imagine facing tomorrow without. The morning of the surgery dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself held its breath. Nora stood at the sink of the hospital family suite, splashing cold water on her face, her reflection pale and trembling in the mirror. Behind her, Marcus was already dressed, his shirt pressed, his tie discarded, but his expression carved from steel. He had been on the phone since before dawn, speaking with lawyers, doctors, anyone who could clear obstacles before they appeared. But nothing could clear the one obstacle that mattered most. Leia lay in the hospital bed, smiling bravely when the surgical team entered to prepare her. Her flower crown from a kind nurse still rested in her dark curls. She clutched her stuffed elephant and looked at both her parents with eyes too wise for 6 years. Mama, Daddy, are you scared? Nora forced a smile. Only a little, baby. Marcus knelt beside her bed, his voice steady. I'm terrified, Princess, because you are the most important person in the world to me. But you're also the bravest, and I know you're going to fight harder than anyone has ever fought. Leia nodded solemnly. I will fight for us. They walked her to the edge of the operating wing, where Dr. Alvarez met them with calm authority. She explained again the risks, the long hours, the thin line between life and death. Marcus listened, his hand gripping Nora's so tightly, her fingers ached. Nora barely heard a word, her heart beating louder than the doctor's voice. Just before the doors swung shut, Leia whispered a promise. I'll come back. Because families don't leave each other. Then she was gone, wheeled into the bright, sterile world of surgery. The waiting began. Hours passed in suffocating silence. Nora sat with her head in her hands, prayers tumbling silently through her mind. Marcus paced the length of the room like a caged lion, until finally Dr. Alvarez appeared, her gown streaked with sweat. The procedure is underway, Beau. Complications have begun. Her immune system is fighting the artificial valves. We are trying new measures, but I cannot promise. Nora's vision blurred, the room spinning. Marcus caught her before she collapsed. His voice was low, fierce, unshakable. Do not give up. She needs us to believe she can do this, as if fate wanted to test them. A new storm broke outside, lightning flashing against the hospital windows. Thunder shook the building, while alarms sounded from the surgical ward down the hall. Nora clutched Marcus's shirt, sobbing. Is this the end? Marcus held her close, whispering through gritted teeth. No, this is the dark hour. But we will not lose her. Not now. Not when she has finally found us. Minutes crawled like years. Then a nurse burst into the room, pale-faced but urgent. Dr. Alvarez requests you both immediately. They rushed down the corridor into a small observation room. Behind the glass, Laya's small body lay on the table, her chest open, surrounded by frantic surgeons. Machines beeped erratically, the rhythm faltering. Dr. Alvarez looked up through the glass, her eyes grave. Then she raised one hand, signaling to Marcus and Nora as if to remind them the choice to keep fighting still belonged to them. Nora's heart shattered as she turned to Marcus. His green eyes burned with fire and fear, but his answer was immediate. Fight. Do whatever it takes. And with that command, the room on the other side of the glass erupted into motion. The battle for Leia's life had reached its breaking point, and for the first time, Nora understood the full truth. She had not begged a stranger outside the hospital that night. She had found the one man willing to stand beside her in the fire until the very end. The clock in the waiting room ticked louder with every second until it felt like a drumbeat of dread. Nora clung to Marcus's hand, her nails digging into his skin as if she needed to anchor herself to something solid or risk being swept away entirely. The storm outside had grown violent, sheets of rain thrashing against the hospital windows, thunder splitting the sky. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for one small heart to decide whether to keep beating. Hours dragged into eternity until Dr. Alvarez appeared again, her mask pulled down, her face streaked with exhaustion. She looked at them not with triumph, but with warning. We are still fighting, she said. The new protocol has slowed the immune response, but her blood pressure remains unstable. The next 2 hours will decide whether her body accepts the changes or rejects them completely. Nora collapsed into the chair, sobs racking her body. Marcus crouched beside her, forcing her to meet his eyes. We do not break now, he said fiercely. She needs our strength as much as the doctors need their skill. Do you hear me, Nora? She nodded through tears, but fear still gnawed at her heart. Then the door burst open. Ethan stormed in, flanked by his lawyer, his hair damp from the storm outside, his smile a thin line of false concern. I heard she's in surgery. I demand to see my daughter. Nora shot to her feet, fury igniting through her fear. You don't get to call her that. You gave up that right the day you walked away. Ethan smirked, glancing at Marcus with disdain. And who exactly are you? Pretending to be her father, pretending to be her husband. Marcus rose slowly, his presence filling the room like thunder. I am not pretending. I am the man who stayed when you ran. I am the father she chose and the husband she deserves. Ethan's lawyer stepped forward, cold and precise. Legally, Mr. Turner still has rights, if your daughter doesn't survive to his surgery. There will be questions about her care, about who made the decisions. The cruelty of the words made Nora stagger. Marcus caught her before she could fall. His voice a low growl. She will survive. And if you so much as whisper another threat in this hospital, I will bury you in court, and in the court of public opinion. Security was called, the confrontation, dragging into chaos until Dr. Alvarez's assistant appeared, her voice sharp. Silence, both of you. The little girl inside is still fighting for her life. If you care at all, you will not steal her strength with your noise. The room stilled. Ethan and his lawyer forced out by guards. Nora slumped against Marcus's chest, trembling. He wrapped his arms around her, whispering fiercely, They cannot touch us. We are a family, and no judge, no opportunist can break what we have built. Hours later, just as despair threatened to suffocate them, the surgical coordinator appeared, pale but smiling. Her heart is stabilizing. The new valves are holding. Nora's scream of relief broke the silence. Marcus's knees buckled and he pulled her into his arms, sobbing against her hair. The storm outside began to ease, rain softening into mist as though the heavens themselves had shifted. But even as hope bloomed, a shadow remained. Ethan's threats hung in the air like smoke. They had won the battle for Leia's life, but the war for their family was far from over. The first rays of dawn spilled across Houston when Dr. Alvarez finally walked into the waiting room. Her scrubs stained, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but her voice steady. Your daughter has made it through the night. Her heart is beating strong. The risk is not gone, but she has survived the impossible. Nora's body gave way as tears poured down her cheeks. Marcus caught her, lifting her into his arms. Before she could collapse, the sterile waiting room seemed to blur around them all. The fear, the storms, the endless hours of silence breaking into raw relief. She's alive, Marcus whispered into her hair. We still have her. When they were finally allowed into the ICU, Leia lay pale but peaceful, her tiny chest rising with new rhythm. Machines beeped around her, but the sound was no longer terrifying. It was a symphony of survival. Marcus moved first to her bedside, taking her hand gently, as if it were made of glass. "Princess," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You did it. You beat the odds." Her eyes flickered open, just enough to see him. A faint smile curved on her lips. "I told you I'm good at impossible things." Nora pressed her forehead to her daughter's hand, whispering a prayer of gratitude. But even in that fragile moment of victory, a shadow lingered. Ethan's threats, his legal claims, the cold greed in his lawyer's words. All of it hovered, waiting to strike once more. 2 days later, while Leia regained her strength, Marcus met with Patricia Lee, his formidable attorney. She slid a folder across the table, her tone brisk. "Ethan filed for emergency custody again, but his case is weaker than ever. Abandonment records missed, child support. Every judge will see through his performance, but he will not stop unless we crush him completely." "How?" Marcus asked, his eyes dark. Patricia hesitated, then spoke. "The fastest, most permanent way is for you and Nora to marry. A step-parent adoption combined with Ethan's history. It'll strip him of every right he claims. It is extreme but effective." Marcus sat back, his chest tight. He had not expected to make a proposal in a hospital conference room with legal documents between them. But when he looked through the glass at Nora sitting by Leia's bed, stroking her daughter's curls, he knew the truth had already been written. He loved them. They were his family. That evening, when the storms had cleared and the chapel lights glowed soft, Marcus led Nora into the small hospital sanctuary. Nurses gathered flowers. Children painted paper hearts to line the walls. Leia sat in her wheelchair, her cheeks still pale, but her eyes brighter than stars. Marcus stood before Nora, his voice shaking as he said, "I came here as a stranger. You begged me to pretend for one day, but every moment since has been the most real of my life. I love you, and I love her. Will you let me fight for both of you for the rest of my days?" Nora's tears fell as she whispered, "Yes." Their vows were simple but fierce, forged in desperation, sealed in love. Rings from the hospital gift shop slid onto trembling fingers. When they kissed, Leia clapped her small hands together, her laughter echoing through the chapel. "Now, I really have a daddy forever." That night, as husband and wife, they sat beside their daughter, watching the monitors blink, steady, strong for the first time in years. The fear was not gone, but it no longer ruled them. The shocking truth was clear. The stranger she had begged outside the hospital was now her husband, the man who had chosen her and her child without hesitation, and together they had turned desperation into a miracle, a family born not from blood, but from love, strong enough to move heaven and earth.
They thought Claire Reynolds was at home crying. In reality, she was buying a $10,000 dress and hiring the best private investigator in the city. The young woman in scarlet red, clinging to Arthur Bennett's arm at the Grand Imperial Club, didn't know 3 crucial things. First, that Claire had orchestrated every detail for her to be there that night. Second, that the flash drive in Claire's Hermes bag contained photos of Lauren with 2 other married men in the last 6 months. And third, most importantly, that in 30 minutes, Lauren would leave that gala ball crying like a child, while Claire would become the legend the NYC high society would tell for the next 50 years. Arthur thought he was trading a boring wife for a luxury inflatable doll. Lauren thought she was conquering a Prince Charming. Neither of them imagined they had just awakened a queen. And queens don't forgive. They destroy with style. The September night at the Grand Imperial Club was steeped in ostentation and fakery. Baccarat crystal chandeliers cast a golden light over the main ballroom, where the cream of New York society gathered for the traditional gala ball of the Hope Foundation. The air conditioning kept the environment at a perfect temperature, in stark contrast to the suffocating heat of hypocrisy that hung among the guests. Arthur Bennett adjusted the cuff of his Italian silk shirt for the third time in 5 minutes. At 38, the real estate entrepreneur had built an empire that guaranteed him a constant presence in society columns. But on that specific night, he felt particularly anxious. Not because of the importance of the event. After all, he had attended dozens of similar balls, but because of the company he had chosen to bring. Lauren Campbell glided through the ballroom as if she owned the place. At 29, the young woman flaunted a more striking, artificial beauty. With platinum blonde hair falling in perfect waves over bare shoulders, enhanced by the scarlet-red Valentino dress Arthur had bought especially for the occasion. The generous neckline and the fabric that hugged every curve of her body did not go unnoticed by the male gazes present, nor by the whispered comments of the society matrons. "Arthur, darling!" The shrill voice of Marguerite Wallace, the wife of a federal senator, cut through the air like a razor. "What a surprise to see you here, and with company." Her eyes scanned Lauren from head to toe, a predatory analysis disguised as social courtesy. "Marguerite, always a pleasure." Arthur forced a smile as he felt sweat form in small beads on his forehead. "This is Lauren Campbell, my special consultant." Lauren laughed, a crystalline sound that echoed through the room. "Consultant? How modest, my love." Her blood-red nails caressed Arthur's arm possessively. "We're much more intimate than that, aren't we?" Arthur's embarrassment was palpable, but Lauren seemed to feed on the situation. She had spent months planning this moment, the night she would finally be introduced to society as Arthur Bennett's new woman. In her youthful and ambitious mind, this was her official coronation. The legitimate wife, Claire, had become a ghostly figure in their conversations, a woman who preferred discretion to the spotlight. And this, for Lauren, was a sign of weakness. "Where is Mrs. Bennett?" Marguerite's question was asked with the surgical precision of someone who knows exactly where to poke to cause pain. "I haven't seen her at a social event in a long time." Arthur swallowed hard. "Claire has been busy with personal projects." "What a shame," Marguerite murmured, although her tone suggested the exact opposite. She was such an elegant woman. She always knew how to behave with class. The word was hung in the air like a death sentence. Lauren felt a twinge of irritation. Why did everyone keep comparing her to that faded woman? Arthur had told her that Claire was boring, dull, a wife who was content to stay home reading books instead of accompanying him to important events. For Lauren, this only proved that some women were born to shine, while others were born to disappear. "Arthur, I need to talk to you about the marina project," interrupted Richard Adams, one of the company's minority partners. The relief on Arthur's face was instantaneous. As the men moved away to discuss business, Lauren remained alone in the center of the ballroom, feeling like a queen on her throne. The flashes of social photographers constantly found her, and she knew her photos would be plastered in the gossip magazines the following week. The new passion of Arthur Bennett, or the well-accompanied entrepreneur, she could already imagine the headlines. The sparkling champagne flowed generously among the guests, and Lauren did not hold back. With each sip, she felt more confident, more in control of the situation. She approached a group of socialites she knew superficially from beauty salons and gyms in the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. "Lauren, what a stunning dress!" commented Patricia Albright, the wife of a federal judge. Valentino? A gift from Arthur, Lauren replied, making sure to emphasize the intimacy. He has such refined taste in choosing women's clothes. The women exchanged knowing glances. They all knew what that meant. Arthur Bennett was publicly flaunting his mistress, a behavior that, while not uncommon in those circles, still caused a stir when done so blatantly. And how are you adapting to your new position? Patricia's question had a double meaning, and they all laughed discreetly. Perfectly, Lauren replied, raising her chin. In fact, I've always felt more at home in this environment than certain people who isolate themselves at home. The malicious comment about Claire did not go unnoticed. The women present knew well the unwritten code of high society. When a wife stopped appearing at events, it usually meant she had lost the battle to a younger, more ambitious rival. On the other side of the ballroom, Arthur tried to focus on the business conversation, but his eyes constantly wandered to Lauren. Part of him felt proud to be with a woman so young and attractive. It was a confirmation of his virility and success. Another part, however, began to question the wisdom of so openly exposing his extramarital relationship. "She's pretty," commented Richard, following Arthur's gaze. "But don't you think it's risky to bring the friend to an event of this magnitude?" "Lauren is not just a friend," Arthur retorted, more defensively than he intended. "We have a serious relationship." "Serious?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "And does your wife know about this?" Arthur looked away. Claire knew, of course. How could she not? The rumors had been rampant for months, and he didn't even bother to be discreet. But Claire, true to her reserved nature, had not made scenes or threats. She had simply withdrawn even further, which Arthur had interpreted as a tacit acceptance of the new situation. "Claire understands that our marriage has evolved into something different," he murmured, sipping Scotch whiskey. In truth, Arthur had married Claire Reynolds 15 years ago for practical reasons. She came from a traditional family, with important connections in the judiciary and politics, connections that were crucial for the growth of his business. Claire was intelligent, cultured, a perfect wife on paper. But as the years passed, Arthur began to see her as part of the furniture, always present, always reliable, but without the sparkle and excitement he had begun to seek elsewhere. Lauren represented everything his wife was not: spontaneous, sensual, impressionable. When he met her at a law firm party, where she worked as a receptionist, he was immediately attracted to her youth and her thirst for social climbing. It was easy to impress her with expensive dinners and luxurious gifts. It was easy to be the hero in the life of someone who came from a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. "Arthur!" Lauren's voice called him back to the present. She was approaching with a radiant smile, followed by a younger man he recognized as Julian Fitzgerald, heir to one of the country's largest fortunes. "Julian was just telling me about the new art collection he recently acquired," Lauren said, her eyes shining with interest. "Picasso, Van Gogh, it's fascinating." Arthur felt a twinge of irritation. Lauren was clearly flirting, and Julian, known for his reputation as a womanizer, seemed willing to reciprocate. It was humiliating to have to compete for his own mistress's attention in public. "Lauren, we need to talk to the event organizers," he interrupted, taking her arm. "But Arthur, Julian was inviting me to see his private gallery," she protested, pouting. "Another time," Arthur replied dryly, guiding her away from the young heir. As they walked through the ballroom, Lauren murmured in his ear, "You don't need to be jealous, my love. You know you're the only man in my life." The words were supposed to reassure him, but Arthur felt a growing unease. There was something about Lauren's attitude that night. An excessive confidence, a presumption that her place was guaranteed, that deeply bothered him. Next to the main table, where the event organizers and some important politicians were, Arthur spotted Charles Dalton, an influential society journalist. The man was watching them with obvious interest, already mentally drafting the note that would appear in his column the next day. "Arthur Bennett, it's been a while." Charles approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And this lovely young lady must be Mrs. Bennett?" The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur felt his face flush, while Lauren, far from being embarrassed, smiled even wider. "Not yet," she replied with a giggle. "But who knows, maybe soon." The insinuation was crystal clear. Lauren was not just content to be the mistress. She had bigger plans, and she was announcing these plans to one of the most dangerous gossips in the city. Arthur forced a nervous laugh. "Charles, you know Lauren Campbell?" "Charles, Lauren is one of the most respected journalists in the city." "It's a huge pleasure," Charles said, kissing Lauren's hand with exaggerated gallantry. "I imagine we'll have a lot to talk about in the coming times." The veiled threat did not go unnoticed by Arthur. Charles Dalton had the power to make or break reputations with a single column. If he decided to turn the situation into a scandal, the consequences could be devastating, not only for his public image, but for his business. As they talked, the ballroom continued to fill. Influential politicians greeted businessmen, socialites showed off their latest jewelry and couture acquisitions, and the orchestra played classical waltzes that created a perfect soundtrack for that theater of appearances. Lauren was in her element. She waved to acquaintances, posed for photos, greeted important people as if she were, in fact, Mrs. Bennett. Every gesture was calculated to solidify her position, to make it clear that she was not just a passing fling, but the new reality in Arthur's life. But in the back of her ambitious mind, Lauren couldn't completely ignore the whispers she heard when she passed by. "Where is Claire Reynolds? How embarrassing. Poor Claire was always such a distinguished lady. Why did everyone insist on talking about that woman?" Lauren had never met her personally. Arthur always said that Claire preferred to avoid conflicts and confrontations. For her, this only confirmed her superiority. While Claire hid at home, she was shining in the halls of high society. What Lauren didn't know was that at that very moment, just a few blocks away, Claire Reynolds was meticulously preparing for her own entrance into the Grand Imperial Club. And when she arrived, nothing would be the same again. Do you think a person can be completely betrayed and still manage to win? What would you do in a situation like this? Leave your opinion in the comments below. Claire Reynolds stood in front of the full-length mirror in her closet, observing her own image with the analytical coldness of a general planning a battle. At 35, she possessed a mature and sophisticated beauty that contrasted drastically with the youthful and obvious appeal of her rival. Her dark brown hair fell in soft waves to her shoulders, framing a face with classic features that didn't need heavy makeup to make an impact. The dress she had chosen for the night was a masterpiece of French haute couture, an impeccably cut black Chanel with pearl details that ran along the discreet but elegant neckline. The piece had cost more than many cars, but it wasn't the price that made it special. It was what it represented. Power, class, legitimacy. Everything that Lauren Campbell was trying to buy with money borrowed from another woman's husband. Claire knew exactly what was happening at the Grand Imperial Club at that moment. She had received no less than 15 calls from concerned friends throughout the week, each one anxious to be the first to tell her about the public humiliation Arthur was inflicting on her. What none of them knew was that Claire had orchestrated every detail of that situation. "Ma'am, the car has arrived," announced Maria, her housekeeper for over a decade, appearing at the closet door. The middle-aged woman watched Claire with admiration and concern in equal measure. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Claire smiled, the first genuine smile she had shown in months. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life, Maria." The truth was, Claire had discovered Arthur's betrayal long before any social gossip, Not because she was particularly sharp, but because Arthur was embarrassingly careless. Receipts from expensive restaurants for 2 people when he was supposedly at work meetings, charges for jewelry and dresses on his corporate card, a female perfume on his clothes that was definitely not hers. During the first few months, Claire felt the familiar pain of betrayal, the wound to her ego, the feeling of inadequacy, the questioning of where she had failed as a wife. But then, on a particularly melancholic Tuesday afternoon, something changed. She was flipping through a wedding photo album when she came across an image of herself on the day of the ceremony. In that photo, she radiated a light that had been lost over the years of marriage. It was at that moment that Claire understood a liberating truth. She hadn't lost Arthur to Lauren because she had failed as a wife. She had lost Arthur because he had failed as a man. From this epiphany, Claire began to plan. Not a vulgar and emotional revenge, but a cold and surgical strategy that would not only expose the couple's charade, but also guarantee her the freedom she had unconsciously desired for years. For the next 6 months, Claire watched. She discreetly hired a private investigator, not to confirm the betrayal she already knew about, but to meticulously document it. Photographs, videos, hotel records, even recordings of compromising conversations that Arthur and Lauren had in public places, thinking they were safe in the bubble of arrogance they had created. More importantly, Claire used this time to reorganize her finances. Arthur had always assumed she was financially dependent on him, a sexist and ignorant assumption. In reality, Claire had inherited a considerable fortune from her paternal grandmother, investments in real estate and stocks that she managed personally without involving her husband. In addition, she had her own art consulting business that earned much more than Arthur imagined. During the months of her absence from social events, Claire had also dedicated herself to herself in a way she hadn't in years. A personal trainer 3 times a week, regular beauty treatments, a complete wardrobe overhaul. Not to win Arthur back. That bridge had been irreversibly burned. But for herself, on that specific night, Claire had chosen the Hope Foundation ball for precise strategic reasons. It was an event that brought together the core of the NYC elite, people who had known her family for decades and who respected her lineage and class. It was also an environment where the unwritten social rules worked in her favor. As much as they tolerated male excesses in private, the public exposure of a marital betrayal was still seen as an act of bad taste that should be punished. Most crucial of all, Claire knew that Arthur would bring Lauren to the ball. It was she herself who, through a mutual friend, had planted the idea in the ambitious young mistress's head. The Hope Foundation ball is the most important event of the year, she had strategically commented during a lunch. That's where society really shows up. Claire's private driver, John, was waiting for her at the entrance of the building. He was a discreet and loyal man who had worked for the Reynolds family for almost 20 years. He knew all the secrets, all the nuances of Claire's life, and his discretion was absolute. "Good evening, Mrs. Reynolds," he greeted, opening the door of the black Mercedes-Benz S-Class. "You look stunning tonight." "Thank you, John." To the Grand Imperial Club. During the 30-minute journey, Claire mentally reviewed every detail of her plan. She had timed her arrival for the exact moment the ball was at its peak, when all the important guests were already present, when the social photographers were most active, when Arthur and Lauren were most relaxed and confident. Claire's phone vibrated with a message from Eleanor Moore, the wife of a federal judge and one of her oldest friends. "Darling, they are shamelessly flaunting themselves. She's practically announcing herself as your replacement. Come quickly and end this farce." Claire smiled as she read the message. Eleanor had always been her fiercest ally, an old guard woman who believed wholeheartedly that certain traditions and social hierarchies should be respected. For Eleanor, Lauren was nothing more than a classless social climber, trying to occupy a place that didn't belong to her. Other messages followed, all from indignant friends, reporting Arthur and Lauren's behavior. "She's wearing a red Valentino, completely inappropriate for a charity event," wrote Patricia Albright. He introduced her as a special consultant, but she herself corrected him, saying they were much more intimate, added Marguerite Wallace. Each message confirmed that Claire's plan was working perfectly. Arthur and Lauren were digging their own graves with an almost comical enthusiasm. Claire thought about her life with Arthur during the first years of marriage. She had genuinely tried to be a good wife, support him in his business, accompany him to social events, keep the house impeccable, and be the perfect companion on all occasions. But Arthur had always seemed to see her as an expensive, well-behaved accessory, not a real partner. As the years passed, she realized that Arthur had chosen her not for love, but for social convenience. She brought respectability, family connections, and an image of the ideal wife that complemented his business ambitions. In return, he offered her financial security and social status, a commercial transaction disguised as romance. Claire's awakening to this reality was gradual, but irreversible. She began to notice how Arthur ignored her during conversations at social events, how he interrupted her when she expressed opinions, how he assumed his own decisions were automatically correct without consulting her perspective. Small humiliations that accumulated over the years until they formed an unbearable weight. When she discovered the betrayal, Claire initially felt devastated. But as she observed Arthur's behavior with Lauren, the way he melted at her feigned naivety, how he felt important playing the mentor to the ambitious young woman, she realized she had not lost true love. She had gotten rid of a burden. "We're arriving, Mrs. Reynolds," John announced, interrupting her reflections. Claire looked out the window and saw the golden lights of the Grand Imperial Club shining in the night. Dozens of luxury cars were parked at the entrance, while paparazzi and social photographers awaited the arrival of important personalities. The red carpet stretched from the sidewalk to the main door, flanked by lush floral arrangements. "John, give me 5 more minutes," Claire requested. "I want my entrance to be memorable." She opened her Hermès bag and checked the contents one last time. In addition to the usual items, lipstick, compact powder, wallet, there was a discreet flash drive containing all the documents and evidence she had collected on Arthur and Lauren. She didn't plan to use it that night, but it was always good to have a trump card up her sleeve. Claire also carried something much more powerful than any physical evidence: the absolute certainty that she was doing the right thing. For 15 years, she had been the perfect, discreet wife who solved problems without making waves. Tonight, she would be the exact opposite. Her phone vibrated once more. It was a message from Charles Dalton, the social journalist. "Claire, darling, I heard you're coming to the ball. That's great. I missed your elegance at these events. See you inside." Perfect. Charles was clearly setting the stage for an epic confrontation between wife and mistress. Like all good gossip journalists, he could sense the drama in the air and wanted to make sure he had a front row seat when everything exploded. "Now, John, it's showtime." The driver smiled through the rearview mirror. He had seen Claire grow from a shy young woman into a powerful one, and knew that this night would be historic. When the Mercedes stopped in front of the Grand Imperial Club, a murmur spread among the photographers. Claire Reynolds had become a mysterious figure in recent months. Her absence from social events had generated speculation and conspiracy theories. Now, her reappearance promised answers. John got out of the car and calmly walked to the back door. The silence was almost palpable. Even the most experienced paparazzi knew they were about to witness something extraordinary. When the door opened and Claire placed her foot on the red carpet, there was a moment of suspended time. She was radiant in a way no one remembered seeing before. More confident, more imposing, more genuinely powerful. The flashes went off in a frantic sequence as Claire walked slowly toward the entrance. Each step was calculated. Each movement was a statement. She greeted the photographers with graceful waves, but did not stop for interviews. There was more important work to be done. At the club entrance, the doorman greeted her with an almost feudal bow. "Mrs. Reynolds, what an honor to have you back with us." "The pleasure is mine, Roberto. A beautiful night, isn't it?" As she walked through the club's corridors toward the main ballroom, Claire could hear the murmur of the crowd inside. Music, laughter, lively conversations, the sound of people who had no idea that their lives were about to be turned upside down. She stopped in front of the ballroom's double doors, adjusted her pearl necklace one last time, and took a deep breath. On the other side of those doors were Arthur and Lauren, probably still basking in the attention they were receiving, still believing they had conquered something important. They had no idea that the true queen had arrived to reclaim her throne. What would you do in a situation like this? Do you believe revenge can be an act of elegance? Let us know your opinion in the comments. The ballroom of the Grand Imperial Club was at its peak when Claire Reynolds made her entrance. The orchestra was playing a Strauss waltz. Couples danced elegantly in the center of the ballroom, and the buzz of conversations created a symphony of well-mannered civility. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light on the impeccable gowns and tuxedos, creating an atmosphere of refined opulence. Arthur was near the bar, laughing loudly at a joke Richard Adams had just told, when the first whisper reached his ears. "Claire has arrived." The smile froze on his face. He turned slowly, searching for the familiar figure of his wife, but he couldn't find her in the crowd. A part of his brain still hoped it was a rumor, that someone had mistaken a brunette in a black dress for Claire. "Arthur," Eleanor Moore's voice sounded behind him like the harbinger of a storm. "Your wife looks stunning tonight." He turned and saw Eleanor with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile that high society women wore when they were about to witness the public humiliation of someone they considered deserving. It was then that he saw her. Claire was entering the main ballroom with the serenity of a queen returning to her palace after a long exile. There was something different about her, an aura of power and self-confidence that Arthur didn't remember ever seeing before. The black Chanel dress hugged her silhouette with mathematical elegance. The pearls on her neck caught the light in a hypnotic way, and her brown hair shone like polished silk. But the most impressive thing was her posture. Claire didn't walk. She glided. Each movement was deliberate, each gesture calculated for maximum impact. And wherever she passed, conversations ceased, gazes turned, and a respectful silence spread like ripples in a pond. Arthur felt his mouth go dry. In 15 years of marriage, he had never seen Claire command a room like that. It was as if she had transformed from a supporting character into the protagonist of her own life. On the other side of the ballroom, Lauren was telling an anecdote to a group of businessmen's wives when she noticed that her audience had become distracted. They were all staring at something or someone behind her. "What's happening?" she asked, turning to follow the direction of their gazes. And then she saw her too. Lauren had often imagined what her first meeting with Arthur's legitimate wife would be like. In her fantasies, Claire would be a faded woman, visibly aged, clearly inferior in every way that mattered. The reality was a brutal shock. The woman walking towards her radiated a natural elegance that no amount of money could buy. There was something almost aristocratic about her posture, an innate class that made Lauren suddenly feel like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. Claire greeted the guests with the perfect grace of someone born into that world. A kiss on the cheek from Marguerite Wallace, a warm handshake with the federal senator, a kind word for the judge's wife. Each interaction reaffirmed her position in the social hierarchy, not as the betrayed wife seeking sympathy, but as the grand lady returning to her rightful place. "Claire, darling!" Patricia Albright's voice cut through the air like a crystal bell. The judge's wife approached with open arms, clearly moved to see her friend after months of absence. "What immense joy to have you back. I missed you so much." The hug between the two women was warm and genuine, in stark contrast to the artificial displays of affection that characterized most interactions in that environment. Lauren watched the scene with growing discomfort, realizing for the first time that Claire was not just Arthur's wife. She was a respected and beloved figure in her own right in that society. "Patricia, you are radiant as always," Claire replied, her melodious voice carrying a tone of genuine affection. "How are you, Roberto? I heard the appointment to the Supreme Court was confirmed." Yes, we're very happy. But tell me about you. Where have you been hiding all these months? You were so missed." Claire smiled with mysterious elegance. "I was taking care of some personal matters. Sometimes a woman needs time to reorganize her priorities." The answer was diplomatically vague, but loaded with subtext that did not go unnoticed by the women present. They all knew about the situation with Arthur and Lauren, and now they were beginning to understand that Claire's absence from social events had not been due to humiliation or despair, but to strategy. While Claire was talking, Arthur remained paralyzed near the bar. Part of him wanted to approach, greet her as if nothing had changed, maintain the facade of a harmonious marriage they had always presented in public. Another part, the cowardly and guilty part, just wanted to disappear. The decision was made by Lauren. The young woman, driven by a toxic mix of jealousy, insecurity, and youthful arrogance, decided that she would not be overshadowed by an older woman, no matter how elegant she was. After all, she was the one with Arthur now. She was the one who wore the expensive gifts, who occupied his bed, who had future plans with him. "Arthur," she whispered, pulling him by the arm. "Let's go greet your wife. It's the polite thing to do." Arthur swallowed hard. "Lauren, maybe this isn't the best time." "Nonsense," she retorted, already walking toward the group around Claire. "We're all civilized adults here." Lauren didn't realize she was about to make the most catastrophic mistake of her young life. In her limited mind, this would be the moment of her official coronation, when she would present herself as Arthur's new woman in front of the previous wife, definitively establishing the new hierarchical order. Claire saw the couples approach long before they got close. Her eyes met Arthur's for a brief moment, and he visibly cringed under her gaze. It was as if she could see right through him, seeing all the guilt, all the embarrassment, all the cowardice he carried. "Claire." Arthur forced a smile as he got close to the group. His voice came out higher-pitched than he intended. What a surprise to see you here." The silence that followed was deafening. All nearby conversations ceased. All eyes turned to the trio, and even the orchestra seemed to lower its volume. It was as if the entire ballroom was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Claire looked at Arthur for a long moment, her expression perfectly serene. When she finally spoke, her voice had the sharp coldness of tempered steel. "Arthur, what an interesting coincidence. I thought you were in Los Angeles this week. An important meeting with investors. Isn't that what you said?" The lie was exposed with surgical elegance. Arthur had invented that excuse to explain his absence from home in recent days, when, in fact, he was at a luxury hotel with Lauren, preparing for the ball. Now, confronted with his own dishonesty in public, he stammered, The meeting was cancelled at the last minute." "What a shame," Claire murmured, her tone suggesting the exact opposite. "Well, at least you didn't miss an event as important as this one." It was then that Lauren decided to intervene. The young woman, misinterpreting the moment, and thinking that Claire was being submissive by not directly confronting the situation, took a step forward with a smile that was meant to be sympathetic, but sounded condescending. "You must be Claire," she said, extending a hand with perfectly manicured red nails. "I'm Lauren Campbell. I've heard so much about you." The group around them collectively held their breath. It was a moment of such palpable tension that even the most distant guests began to discreetly approach, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Claire looked at Lauren's outstretched hand for a moment that seemed eternal. Then, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, she greeted her delicately. "Lauren, yes, I've also heard a lot about you." The phrase was uttered with such elegance that it took a few seconds for Lauren to realize the poison contained within it. "Arthur told me you work together," Claire continued, her voice maintaining the perfectly polite tone of high society. "Something about project development consulting?" Arthur opened his mouth to reply, but Lauren interrupted him, clearly eager to establish her true position. "Oh, we're much more than co-workers," she laughed, a high-pitched sound that echoed uncomfortably in the silence of the ballroom. "In fact, Arthur and I have a very special relationship." The words came out of her mouth with the confidence of someone who believed they were revealing a truth that would give them power over the situation. Instead, she had just fallen into the most elegant trap ever built at a New York social event. Claire tilted her head slightly, as if she were processing a particularly interesting piece of information. "Ah, I see," she said, her voice still maintaining that deadly politeness. "How brave, on your part, to make this public in this way." The word brave was pronounced in such a way that it sounded exactly like its antonym. Lauren began to realize that something was wrong, but her youth and inexperience did not allow her to fully decode the nuances of the conversation. Arthur, on the other hand, was pale as paper. He knew Claire well enough to recognize the signs of danger: the overly polite tone, the smile that didn't reach her eyes, the upright and controlled posture. She was furious, but expressing that fury through the refined codes of high society, which made her infinitely more dangerous than any emotional outburst. "Claire," he tried to intervene, "maybe we should—" "Oh, Arthur," she interrupted him softly. "There's no need for embarrassment between civilized people." She turned to Lauren with renewed interest. "Tell me, darling, how long have you two been working together?" Lauren, interpreting the question as an opportunity to establish her supremacy, replied with youthful pride. "About 8 months. Arthur has been a wonderful mentor." "Mentor," Claire repeated, as if savoring the word. "What an interesting term to describe the relationship." The air in the ballroom was so charged with tension that even the waiters had stopped circulating with the champagne trays. Dozens of eyes were fixed on the trio, and Charles Dalton, the social journalist, watched everything from a strategic distance, clearly taking mental notes for his column the next day. Eleanor Moore approached the group with a smile that promised trouble. "Claire, darling," she said, her voice full of feigned innocence, "what a stunning dress! Chanel, isn't it? I've always been envious of your impeccable taste in fashion." "Thank you, Eleanor. You know how it is. Some pieces never go out of style, do they?" The insinuation was clear. True elegance is timeless, unlike the passing trends displayed by certain younger people. Lauren, finally beginning to realize that she was being subtly attacked, decided to fight back. "Your dress is also beautiful," she said to Claire, her tone attempting to sound generous but failing miserably. "Very classic. It must have been awfully expensive." The comment was a grotesque mistake. To suggest that Claire cared about the price of her clothes, or worse, that she needed to justify her spending, was a demonstration of a lack of class that made several women present gasp in shock. Claire smiled, this time a truly dangerous smile. "My dear," she said, her voice soft as velvet but sharp as a razor, "when you have true class, the price becomes irrelevant. It's something you are either born with or you never acquire. The phrase fell on Lauren like a silent bomb. For a moment, the young woman was speechless, slowly processing the fact that she had been publicly declassed in the most elegant way possible. Arthur tried to intervene again, his voice desperate. "Well, I think we should all—" "Arthur," Claire interrupted him again, this time turning to him with her full attention. "Since we're all here, gathered in such a casual way, maybe it's a good time to clarify a few things." The entire ballroom seemed to have stopped. Even the orchestra had ceased playing, as if the musicians also wanted to hear what would happen next. "Clarifications are always welcome," murmured Eleanor Moore, barely able to contain her excitement. Claire adjusted the pearls on her neck with deliberately slow movements, like a matador preparing the final thrust. "You see," she said, her voice now carrying a tone of genuine amusement, "there are certain illusions that need to be dispelled before they cause more embarrassment than they already have." Lauren felt a shiver of panic run down her spine. There was something in Claire's attitude, an absolute confidence, an almost predatory serenity, that suggested she knew something important, something that would completely change the game. "I don't understand," Lauren gasped. "Oh, darling," Claire replied, her smile now genuinely radiant. "You will understand. All of you will." And it was then that Claire Reynolds began to methodically, elegantly, and irreversibly destroy the lives of everyone who had underestimated her power. "Arthur," Claire said, her voice cutting through the silence of the ballroom like crystal against crystal. "Since we're among friends, why don't you tell Lauren about our conversation last night?" Arthur's face paled to a color that rivaled the pearls on his wife's neck. His eyes widened in absolute panic, because there had been no conversation with Claire the night before, or on any night in recent weeks. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but his trembling voice betrayed his nervousness. Claire tilted her head with feigned curiosity, as if she were genuinely surprised by her husband's answer. "You don't? How strange. Maybe my memory is failing me." She paused theatrically, scanning the circle of spectators that had formed around them. "Or maybe you forgot to mention to your mentor that we are still married." The word mentor was pronounced with such irony that several people in the group had to stifle nervous giggles. Lauren felt the blood rush to her face, finally understanding that she was being publicly ridiculed. "Of course we know you're married," Lauren said, trying to regain some control over the situation. "But marriages evolve, don't they? Sometimes people find happiness in different places." "Ah, yes," Claire agreed with a graceful nod. "Evolution, a fascinating concept." She turned to Eleanor Moore with a conspiratorial air. "Eleanor, you who have been married for 30 years to Roberto, have you experienced this evolution?" Eleanor laughed, a crystalline sound full of aristocratic malice. "Never, darling. Roberto knows his place very well." The comment was a direct thrust at Arthur's masculinity, suggesting that he had failed as a man by not keeping his house in order. Several men present coughed uncomfortably, while their wives exchanged approving glances. Marguerite Wallace joined the group, clearly not wanting to miss the spectacle. "Claire, it's so good to see you at our events again," she said with false effusiveness. "Your presence always elevates the level of any occasion." "That's very kind, Marguerite. I was just explaining to young Lauren how certain traditions work in our society." Lauren felt increasingly cornered. There was something about the way these women spoke, always polite, always elegant, but carrying a subtle venom that she couldn't counter because she didn't master the necessary social codes. "Traditions can be outdated," she said, trying to sound sophisticated. "The modern world allows people to be more authentic in their relationships." The silence that followed was so profound that you could hear the tinkling of the chandelier crystals gently swaying with the air-conditioning breeze. Claire watched Lauren for a long moment, like a feline studying its prey before the fatal pounce. Authenticity, she repeated slowly. What a powerful word. You're right, darling. Authenticity is fundamental. She paused, her smile becoming predatory. That's why I think it's time for us to be completely authentic about this situation. Arthur tried to intervene desperately. Claire, maybe this isn't the place. Oh, but it is exactly the right place, she interrupted him, her voice still maintaining that deadly politeness. After all, it was here that you chose to make your partnership public. It's only fair to clarify a few details for our dear friends. Charles Dalton had approached discreetly, his journalist's expression sniffing out the story of the century. Other guests also drew closer, creating an ever-widening circle around the central trio. You see, Claire continued, now, addressing the audience directly, dear Lauren believes she conquered my husband's heart through her youth and authenticity. She paused for dramatic effect. What she doesn't know is that Arthur has a very specific pattern when it comes to his extramarital affairs. Lauren's eyes widened, suddenly realizing she was about to discover something devastating. A pattern? Asked Eleanor, clearly enjoying herself. Oh, yes. Young, ambitious women from humble backgrounds who are easily dazzled by expensive gifts and promises of social climbing. Claire enumerated the characteristics with the precision of a scientist cataloging specimens. In the last 15 years, there have been at least, 6 of them. The number fell on Lauren like a hammer. She wasn't special. She wasn't unique. She was just the most recent in a long line of temporary replacements. Arthur was clearly desperate. Claire, please. Oh, Arthur, don't be modest, she said with false admiration. You have a special talent for finding these girls, always with the same profile. Receptionists, secretaries, hostesses, impressionable young women who confuse male attention with true love. Patricia Albright couldn't hold back a giggle. And what happened to the other 5, darling? Well, Claire replied, as if she were telling a funny anecdote at a tea party. Some were discreetly dismissed when they started making inconvenient demands. Others found out for themselves that they weren't as special as they imagined. 1 or 2 even managed advantageous marriages to more available men. Lauren felt the world spinning around her. Everything she had believed about her relationship with Arthur, its uniqueness, their future plans, her privileged position, was crumbling like a house of cards. But the thing is, Claire continued, now speaking directly to Lauren, you made a mistake that none of the others made. What mistake? The question came out as a strangled whisper. You believed you had won. The words fell on Lauren with the weight of a legal sentence. She looked around, seeing for the first time the expressions of the guests. Not admiration or envy, as she had imagined, but pity mixed with aristocratic contempt. Arthur never told me about the others, she stammered, turning to him in search of denial, explanation, anything that would restore her reality. Arthur couldn't look her in the eye. His guilt was stamped on his face like a tattoo. Of course he didn't tell you, Claire said softly. Why would he? It would ruin the fantasy he creates for each of you. The fantasy that you're special, that you're different, that this time it's true love. Eleanor Moore shook her head with theatrical disapproval. Men can be so cruel, can't they? Making these poor girls believe in fairy tales. The cruelty, Claire said, is not in having extramarital affairs. Powerful men have always had mistresses. It's almost a tradition. The cruelty is in creating false expectations, in making these women believe they can occupy a place that was never intended for them. Lauren finally exploded. And what is that place? The place of the submissive wife who accepts everything in silence? The entire ballroom held its breath. It was the first time anyone had directly confronted Claire, and everyone wanted to see how she would respond. Claire smiled, not the elegant, controlled smile she had maintained all night, but a genuine, almost amused smile. "Oh, my sweet girl," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of pity and condescension. You really don't understand, do you? You think I'm here as the humiliated wife, trying to win back a cheating husband. She paused, her eyes sweeping over all the faces around her. I didn't come here to fight for Arthur. I came to give him back. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the sound of the waiter's shoes on the marble could be heard. Give him back? Lauren repeated, confused. Yes, darling, you can have him. Claire made an elegant gesture with her hand, as if she were handing over a not-so-desirable gift. In fact, I insist you keep him. After all, you both deserve each other. Arthur finally found his voice. Claire, what are you talking about? I'm talking about freedom, Arthur. Yours and mine. She opened her Hermes bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. The divorce papers were filed yesterday. You should receive the official notification on Monday. The envelope passed from hand to hand, like a grenade with the pin removed. Arthur held it with trembling fingers, his face expressing absolute shock. But we didn't even talk about this. We did talk about it. For 8 months, Arthur. Every time you came home with another woman's perfume. Every time you lied about where you had been. Every time you treated me like a piece of furniture that decorates the house but doesn't participate in the life that happens inside it. Claire's voice remained serene, but there was tempered steel in every word. The conversation was long and one-sided, but it happened. Lauren looked at Arthur, expecting him to protest, to declare his love for her, to confirm the future plans they had made together. Instead, he looked at the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode. How much do you want? Was the first thing he managed to say. The question revealed so much about his character that several women present made barely disguised expressions of disgust. Oh, Arthur, Claire said, shaking her head with feigned sadness. Always reducing everything to money. I don't want your money, darling. I have my own. Your own? Yes. Grandma Beatrice's inheritance, which you always assumed was insignificant because it was just women's things like real estate and stocks, is actually worth more than your company. She smiled. Much more. The shock on Arthur's face was comical. For 15 years, he had assumed he was the sole provider for the family, the only one with significant resources. To discover that his wife was not only financially independent, but potentially richer than he was a devastating blow to his masculine ego. Besides, Claire continued casually, my art consulting business has grown quite a bit in recent years. International clients, you know, people who value Chelsea authenticity and expertise. Lauren finally understood the full dimension of her humiliation. She had gambled everything on a man she now discovered was not even half the prize she had imagined him to be. So, you're giving us your blessing? She stammered, trying to find some thread of dignity to cling to. Oh, my dear, it's not quite a blessing, Claire replied with deadly gentleness. It's more like returning a defective product to the store. The phrase echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Several people laughed openly, unable to contain their reaction to the brutal elegance of the response. Arthur finally exploded. Claire, you can't humiliate me like this in public. Humiliate you? She seemed genuinely surprised. Arthur, darling, I haven't done anything but tell the truth. If the truth is humiliating, maybe the problem isn't with me. Charles Dalton approached with his social predator smile. Claire, can I have a statement for my column? Of course, Charles. She turned to him with the grace of a seasoned actress. You can say that I'm starting a new chapter in my life. Sometimes, when a door closes, we realize that it was actually holding us captive in a place too small for our dreams. And what about future plans? I'm moving to Paris next week. I have some interesting projects waiting for me there. Paris. The word fell on Arthur like a final sentence. Claire was not just divorcing him. She was literally fleeing the country, putting an ocean between them. Lauren, trying one last desperate move, said, Well, at least now Arthur and I can be happy together without secrets or lies. Claire looked at her with a mixture of pity and amusement. "Oh, my sweet, naive girl," she said, her voice full of an almost maternal condescension. "Do you really think that a man who cheated on his wife with you won't cheat on you with another?" The truth of the statement hit Lauren like a punch to the stomach. She looked at Arthur, searching for some sign of denial, some guarantee of future fidelity. Instead, she saw a man in total panic, more concerned with the financial implications of the divorce than with the feelings of either of the two women present. "Arthur," she whispered, a clear plea in her voice. He didn't answer. He couldn't answer, because deep down, he knew Claire was right. And it was in that moment of absolute silence that Claire Reynolds delivered the final blow. "Well," Claire said, adjusting the pearls on her neck with an elegant and definitive movement. "It was a pleasure to clarify all of this. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to say goodbye to some dear friends before my trip." She turned to leave, but stopped as if she had remembered something important. "Oh, and Lauren?" The young woman looked up hopefully, perhaps believing that Claire would offer her some word of reconciliation or advice. "The red dress looks beautiful on you, but for charity events, more sober colors are more appropriate. It's a matter of social etiquette." The final criticism was delivered with such elegance that even the most experienced observers needed a few seconds to fully process the brutality of the comment. Claire had just given a lesson in etiquette in the middle of a public humiliation, definitively establishing the social hierarchy between them. Lauren stood still, paralyzed by shame, while Claire walked away gracefully. Arthur remained beside her, but it was obvious to everyone that he was in a state of shock, still processing the speed with which his life had fallen apart. Charles Dalton watched the scene with the sharp gaze of someone who had just witnessed the social story of the year. He was already mentally drafting the headline, "The Elegant Revenge: How Claire Reynolds Turned Humiliation into Triumph at the Most Talked About Ball of the Season." As Claire circulated through the ballroom, saying goodbye to guests, each conversation reaffirmed her position as the true winner of the night. Eleanor Moore hugged her warmly. "Darling, you were masterful. I've never seen anyone maintain so much class in such a delicate situation." "Thank you, Eleanor. Sometimes elegance is the best revenge." Patricia Albright joined the group. "Paris, how romantic. Do you have specific plans there?" "As a matter of fact, I do." Claire's eyes sparkled with genuine enthusiasm. "I've been invited to be an art consultant for a very prestigious gallery in the 16th arrondissement. And there are other interesting possibilities as well." The mysterious smile on her face suggested that there was much more to the story, but Claire was not inclined to give out details. She would let others' imaginations fill in the blanks. On the other side of the ballroom, Lauren finally began to move, like a sleepwalker waking from a nightmare. She looked around and realized that she had become the center of a very different kind of attention, not admiration, but pity mixed with malice. Whispers followed her movements. Poor thing, she didn't know what she was getting into. She thought she was going to get into high society through the back door. Arthur always had questionable taste in mistresses. Each comment was like a stab at her pride. Lauren had arrived at the ball, believing she would be crowned the new queen. Instead, she was publicly unmasked as a naive and inadequate pretender. Arthur tried to approach her. "Lauren, let's talk privately." "No." She recoiled as if he were contagious. "Don't touch me. You lied to me about everything." Tears began to stream down Lauren's perfect makeup, creating dark trails on her cheeks. The realization that she had been just one more in a long line of disposable women was devastating for someone who had always considered herself special. "Lauren, please, let me explain." Arthur tried again, but his voice sounded desperate and unconvincing. "Explain what? That I'm the disposable one? That I was never special? That you never intended to marry me?" Her voice grew louder and louder, attracting even more glances. "I quit my job, moved out of my apartment, told my family I was going to marry an important businessman." The public confession of her naivety only deepened her humiliation. Some guests shook their heads in pity, while others exchanged "I told you so" looks, typical of high society when their predictions are confirmed. Julian Fitzgerald, the young heir who had flirted with her earlier, approached with a condescending smile. "Lauren, don't be so desperate. Arthur was always known for his temporary affairs. You shouldn't have gotten so attached." The remark, while meant to be comforting, only confirmed that all of society knew about Arthur's reputation, except her. Lauren realized she had been the last to know about her own relationship. Meanwhile, Claire continued her triumphant farewell tour. Each conversation revealed more details about her future plans, painting the picture of a woman who had not only escaped an unhappy marriage, but had meticulously planned her ascent to a better life. "The Dubois Gallery is one of the most respected in Paris," she told a group of art enthusiasts. "They were impressed with my work on the Monet Newman exhibition last year." What she didn't mention, but what they would discover later through international gossip channels, was that Pierre Dubois, the gallery owner, was an aristocratic widower in his late 40s, who had been charmed not only by Claire's professional expertise, but also by her personal elegance. Marguerite Wallace pulled Claire into a more private corner. "Darling, can I ask an indiscreet question? This move to Paris, is there someone waiting for you there?" Claire smiled with calculated mystery. "Let's just say there are interesting possibilities. A man who values intelligence as much as beauty, who understands that a woman can be a partner, not just an ornament. French? With the elegance that only the French possess. And," she lowered her voice conspiratorially, "with resources that make Arthur's business look like a corner bazaar." Marguerite was delighted. "Darling, you are simply inspirational. To turn betrayal into liberation, humiliation into triumph, is a work of art." On the other side of the ballroom, Arthur finally managed to calm Lauren enough for a more private conversation. They moved away to one of the club's smaller rooms, away from curious glances. "Lauren, I know you must be confused, but we can get through this." "Get through this?" She stared at him with disbelief. "Arthur, you made a fool of me for 8 months, made me believe I was special, that I had a future with you. And you do. Now that Claire is asking for a divorce, we can finally be together officially. With what money?" The question came out sharper than she intended. "You heard what she said. She's richer than you. In the divorce, you could lose half of everything you have." The financial reality hit Arthur like a slap. For years, he had assumed he controlled all the couple's finances. To discover that Claire not only had her own resources, but that they were superior to his, was a devastating shock. "That can't be true," he murmured. "The stocks, the real estate, they're just family inheritances. Inheritances that are worth more than your company." Lauren was beginning to see Arthur for who he really was. Not the successful, powerful businessman she had imagined, but a middle-aged man who had just discovered his wife was his most valuable asset. And he had lost her. At that moment, Charles Dalton appeared at the door of the room. "Arthur, can I have a word for my column tomorrow?" "There's nothing to comment on," Arthur replied dryly. "Oh, but there is. The most elegant wife in New York society announcing her move to Paris. One of the most civilized divorces I've ever witnessed. It's a fascinating story." Charles wasn't really asking for permission. He was informing them that the story would be published with or without Arthur's cooperation. "And you, Lauren?" Charles turned to her with journalistic interest. "Any comment on the evening's events?" Lauren looked at Arthur, expecting him to defend her, to publicly declare their future plans together. Instead, he seemed to shrink even more, clearly unwilling to commit publicly to her after the night's disaster. The lack of support was the last straw. Lauren realized she had lost not only the battle against Claire, but also any chance of a future with Arthur. He was too cowardly to defend her when she needed it, too weak to take responsibility for his own actions. "My only comment," she said, straightening her shoulders with a newfound dignity, "is that some life lessons are too expensive to be worth it." With those words, Lauren left the room, leaving Arthur alone with Charles Dalton and the weight of his own choices. 3 years later, Paris. The apartment in the 16th arrondissement had a view of the Eiffel Tower and was decorated with a perfect combination of French elegance and Brazilian sophistication. Claire Reynolds, now Claire Dubois, was sitting on the terrace, drinking coffee while watching her 2-year-old twins, Henry and Beatrice, play in the private garden. Pierre Dubois entered the terrace carrying a tray with fresh croissants and the morning newspaper. "Mon amour," he said, gently kissing Claire's forehead. "There's an interesting article here about the United States." Claire smiled, accepting the cup of coffee he offered her. At 38, she radiated a happiness she had never experienced during her 15 years of marriage to Arthur. Pierre was not just a better husband. He was a true partner, someone who respected her intelligence and ambition as much as he admired her beauty. "What kind of article?" "About corporate bankruptcies. It seems a real estate developer called Bennett Ventures closed its doors last month." "Arthur?" "Apparently. The article mentions poor financial management and lawsuits. The owner, Arthur Bennett, is being investigated for tax irregularities." Claire felt no pleasure at the news. That phase of her life was completely over. But there was a certain poetic justice in the fact that Arthur, who had always considered himself financially superior to her, had lost everything due to his own incompetence. "And the young woman he was with that night at the Grand Imperial Club?" asked Pierre, who knew the whole story. "Lauren." Claire thought for a moment. "I heard she married a dentist in Connecticut. Apparently she learned her lesson about not betting on losing horses." Pierre laughed, a rich, warm sound that echoed across the terrace. "You're terrible, my darling, but it's poetic justice, as we say." Henry ran to the table, speaking an adorable mix of English and French. "Mommy, look! I picked a flower for you!" Claire picked up her son, accepting the small daisy he had picked in the garden. Beatrice soon joined them, demanding equal attention. "Mes petits trésors," Pierre murmured, watching the scene with obvious adoration. This was the life Claire had built for herself, not as revenge against Arthur, but as a reward for her own courage. She had transformed betrayal into liberation, humiliation into opportunity, and an ending into a new beginning. The Dubois Gallery had become one of the most prestigious in Paris under her curatorship, and she was expecting her 3rd child, a girl they would name Sophia, in honor of the grandmother who had left her the inheritance that made her independence possible. As she watched her children play in the Parisian garden, Claire reflected on the night at the Grand Imperial Club 3 years ago. She had planned every detail of that public humiliation. But now she realized that the true victory had not been destroying Arthur and Lauren that night. The true victory was this: a life built on her own terms, with a man who loved her completely, children who filled her heart, and a career that fulfilled her soul. In the end, Claire Reynolds had discovered that the best revenge is not the destruction of your enemies, but the construction of a life so spectacular that it makes everything they did to try to diminish you irrelevant.